today is a unique and special, extra special one, since we're honoring Dr. Rachel Korazim. We have CSP celebrating its 22nd year, and in its 21st year, CSP Maimonides Award for Excellence in Jewish Education was founded to recognize amazing and dynamic teachers who not just sustained us at a challenging time, but who brought us together as a community of learners and inspired us with engaging and provocative material. The inaugural award was presented on June 13th to Rabbi Charles Savanor, who I think is with us here, who was at the time the director of congregational education at Park Avenue Synagogue in New York City, and just recently became the executive director of Civic Spirit, a nonprofit that educates, inspires, and empowers schools across faith traditions to enhance civic belonging, knowledge, and responsibility in their student and faculty community. Today, we honor Dr. Rachel Korazim as winner of CSP's second annual Maimonides Award for Excellence in Jewish Education for her work in bringing Israeli poetry to life. Dr. Rachel Korazim is a powerful speaker and a freelance Jewish education consultant specializing in curriculum development for Israel and Holocaust education. She's involved with Jewish education worldwide, creating and implementing in-service training programs for educators, writing educational materials, counseling, and teaching. As one of the founders and directors of a special program for Israeli soldiers from disadvantaged backgrounds, Korazim was responsible for creating the educational framework and training teachers for the implementation of the program. Born in Israel, she served in the IDF as an officer in the Central Training Base for Women and was later a member of the IDF delegation to Niger in West Africa. She's a graduate of Haifa University with a PhD in Jewish education. When COVID forced us online, Dr. Rachel Korazim started a weekly online series committed to the exploration of Israeli poets and poetry, and has built an amazing online community of poetry aficionados. We are so thankful for all she has done and continues to do. And I just learned, I think there are 420 recorded programs online from this program. And so just before I introduce our speakers, Rachel, if you want to say a few words.
Yes, and I'll try to keep them few because I know how these programs are run and how every minute is precious. So welcome, everybody. It's wonderful to see. I was just looking, and I will continue looking through the different frames on my screen to see family members like my husband, who physically and emotionally is closest right now because he's just on the other side of the wall where I'm speaking to you, and friends from other parts of Israel and friends from all over the world who have joined, and it's wonderful to see you. I want to say a word to the people who have participated here. My sister joined as well, and I know that the kids are coming and grandchildren, so family is wonderful to have. I want to say a word to the people who participate in Shirel. It wasn't a weekly program. When the program started at the beginning of Corona, it was a daily program 5 times a week, and even today we teach 4 times a week. This is an ongoing community of people who study in English, in Hebrew, and in Ivrit Kala. But having been granted this amazing honor, and I know a lot will be said about literature, and this is what we are here for today, I want to take another half a minute and a sentence to recognize a special guest. I hope you could see her because her video camera is turned on, and the name is Safa Yunis. Safa is a friend from here, Jaffa. I know her for a year and a half, maybe. And we are doing together a series of cultural, poetic meetings that are hosted in an amazing center that Safa had created, where we get Hebrew writing and Arabic writing poets, mainly women, but not only, and audiences to discuss not on Zoom, face-to-face in an amazing environment. And the award that you so graciously granted me today, all of it will go towards continuing the activity, one of which will happen as early as tomorrow night here in Jaffa. Join us if you can. Thank you for this amazing event. Welcome, everybody, and let the program start. Toda rabba, Shirel.
Thank you, Rachel. As you all know, we'll make sure in the follow-up email to include all the information, including the program Rachel just mentioned of Safa Yunus, and we'll send you all the details for those of you who want to take part. So a moment before I'm introducing our speakers, this is program number 499, online program number 499, and you can see a list of our upcoming programs on our website. I'm going to skip detailing them for now just to save us time. But if you're new to CSP, this is the level of what we do, and the website is in the chat, and you're more than welcome to check out what we're doing. And I'm happy to introduce our speakers in honor of Rachel Korazim. Today, Basmat Hazan will be in conversation with Ruby Namdar, and I'll introduce first Basmat. Basmat Hazan is an award-winning theater director, playwright, author, and facilitator of text study. She studied Jewish thought and theater at Hebrew University and the School of Visual Theater in Jerusalem. A cultural entrepreneur, Basmat is the founder of Laba, a Jewish house of study and culture laboratory located in New York City. She is also co-founder, artistic director of Here Now, Bizman Emet, program for artists in Jerusalem, as well as the host for the television program L'Shem Shinui on the community channel in Jerusalem. Ruby Namdar was born and raised in Jerusalem to a family of Iranian-Jewish heritage. His first book, Haviv, from 2000, won the Ministry of Culture's Award for Best First Publication. His novel, The Ruined House, has won the Sapir Prize, Israel's most prestigious literary award. The Ruined House was translated into English by Hillel Halkin and recognized by the New York Times as a masterpiece of modern religious literature. He currently lives in New York City with his wife and 2 daughters and teaches Jewish literature, focusing on Bible and Talmudic narrative. So I'm happy and really honored to even be part of this call, and I'll hand it over to Basmat and Ruby to take us into the session. Thank you.
Thank you, Shirel. And I'm also very honored to be here. I know Rachel for many, many years. She was actually my teacher, I think more than 30 years ago when I was in the army. And we fell in love immediately. And then we discovered our mutual Hungarian roots. And but I think roots are going to be a very, I would say, fundamental topic this evening. So it's really interesting. And I think that when I think of Rachel and what she does, I think of 2 things, which I really want to bring into the beginning of my conversation with Ruby. The first thing is really the passion of the Hebrew language and the passion of the very, very, I would say, pluralistic, open-minded, curious Jewish identity. And playing that role in the world of being both, I would say, very, very rooted in the Jewish identity, and in the other hand, very, very open to other cultural, I would say, tours and other cultures and other religions, and the conversation and dialogue and ongoing dialogue with them is, I think, a very, very special thing that Rachel brings to whatever she does. And the other thing is really asking those questions that we're going to talk about today, the questions of really what do you do when all of a sudden at the beginning of this century, we find ourselves in this very interesting position where the Hebrew that was silent as a spoken language for 2,000 years was still a literary, I would say, language, but is back to life, and people write books and poetry. And on the other hand, there are people around the world who don't necessarily speak Hebrew, and it's not their native language in any way. And I think what Rachel does by bridging those two components is what we're going to look into today. So thank you for inviting us this evening to this conversation. And thank you, Rachel, for everything that you're doing in this world and for what you are in my life. So Ruby, ready? You have to unmute yourself.
I'm unmuted.
Yes. So we're going to start. So I think, Ruby, as a first question, I would ask you, what do you think is special about the Hebrew language? Is it the language for you, just another language, or do you think there is something about Hebrew that is worth looking into?
I like that you start small, right, with small talk. That could be a year of studying right there, which I think we've done. So I want to start, first of all, by acknowledging the wonderful accomplishment of Dr. Rachel Korazim, and how honored and excited I am to be here today, because it's so rare to have people whose passion for the Hebrew literature is so contagious that it crosses oceans, and oceans that are not just literal watery oceans, but the oceanic distances between cultures, languages, worldviews. You mentioned the work of translator and bridge building. So this is a very long bridge between like the world of Hebrew and between the New World in America. And so it's a real honor for me to be here as part of this celebration of this wonderful achievement, and that we are all benefiting from. Not just those who study with Rachel, or have the privilege of studying with Rachel directly, but the fact that this kind of works creates the Hebrew sphere as what I believe it should be, a worldwide sphere, and not just a small, a parochial kind of local patriotic navel gazing sphere. I'm moving to your question, and I never tire of speaking about the Hebrew. I feel that there is something so incredibly, first of all, incredible about the Hebrew itself, but also so incredibly complex and unusual about this language. And it is on so many levels, and I would love to elaborate a little. When you walk into a language, and I speak now in spatial terms because I do believe that languages create their own space, their own universe, their own gravity center. When you walk into the Hebrew world, you are surrounded by the mythology of the language, the inner mythology of the language, the way the language perceives itself. Every language has its own mythology. But the mythology of Hebrew is particularly dramatic because, first and foremost, Hebrew views itself as the language of creation. And of course, the language of the Bible. And the Bible, the Hebrew Bible, that is, Tanakh as we call it, is not only the base for our Jewish civilization, it is also the base for all monotheistic civilizations. And because, for now, monotheistic civilizations are still culturally hegemonous in the world, I don't know how long this would last, but for now, for sure, in the past, let's say, few hundred years, in ways, the Bible belongs and influenced cultures of people whose cultural roots are not necessarily, in Judaism, Islam, or Christianity. Everyone in the world feels, in a way, that the Bible is part of their cultural DNA. And here's the Hebrew, the language of the Bible. This puts the Hebrew in a very dramatic and volatile position. A language that was always spoken by a small group of people, at the same time was perceived itself and was perceived by others as the kind of secret code of humanity, a secret universal code for the secrets of the universe. This is a very, very strange cultural position to be in. Let's understand it. Let's elaborate a little. When we speak about the language of creation, and I know, Basmat, given that you and I love to teach together and separately and love to teach Bible, and we have spoken endless times with various groups of artists and writers about this amazing moment in Genesis 1, where the world is spoken into being. The world, according, again, to the mythology of the language and the Bible, was spoken into being. Not made, it is created by utterances. And these utterances, because the Bible is in Hebrew, are perceived as Hebrew utterances. Therefore, the Hebrew is not just a regular language that describes reality. It is also the language that created reality. That is a very interesting duality here. To be at the same time a descriptive language, but also the cause of the world that the language describes. And they're partners, therefore, in maintaining the language. It's humans, it's also the divine. It's the language of humans, and yet it's the language of the divine. So that's a very big self-perception of a language, which makes the language, in my opinion, a wonderful language to work with. For people, I think, with certain egos that are kind of, not afraid of the challenge of partnering with the divine, in like maintaining the divine language. And then there's a new element that you mentioned. The fact that the Hebrew was, as a spoken language, dormant for more than 2,000 years. Actually, once our people went to the Babylonian exile, they moved to speaking in Aramaic, which was kind of like the English of the time, right? The vernacular of the worlds in which they now inhabited. And the Hebrew became a special inner shrine of a certain authentic identity, almost secret. And there was an elitist in the good sense of the word, elitist element to the Hebrew. It was kept in its purity. It was for people who were literate, people who were focused on preserving culture, people who were focused on preserving memory. These are the people who kept the Hebrew alive as a language of letters. And yes, it had very strong literary qualities because it remained in ways, and I'm using this term now with cautiously, it remained pure in its purity because it was not muddied by the everyday. And therefore, we were handed, and you said it so well in your opening words, when Zionism appeared and opened up this 2D, wonderful two-dimensional language and turned it into a three-dimensional language that stands and walks and actually speaks, we were handed a very, very exciting, limited but pure substance. And I think that our generation is perhaps the last generation that is still with one foot. We are in the world of the Hebrew as a two-dimensional, magical, secret language of letters, and our other foot stands in the world in which Hebrew has been normalized, so to speak, and is now a walking, moving, living language that is constantly muddied by the human factor. Now, some of us see great beauty in this muddying. I think our friends from Tel Aviv, let's be a little local, Yerushalmim, local patriotic. I think the Tel Aviv School of Hebrew Literature is infatuated with the non-perfect, non-pure, a muddied, alive Hebrew that does not look back all the time. Others who are more purists and more have kind of romantic tendencies, we still look back at the Hebrew as the founders of, the fathers of mothers of Zionism found it in that jewel box of the books, of the Hebrew books, before it became a normal language. I know that me personally, as a writer, but also as a speaker, have always been more attracted to the romantic, purest Hebrew of the past than to the twists and turns of spoken Hebrew, as so many of our friends and colleagues write in nowadays. It's a tendency, it's a question of a tendency. So the Hebrew is really so much more than a language. And in order to add to this, do I have time for all this? Am I just over? I want to add one more element. That on top of all this, Hebrew was never just a language, period, because there was always an ideology that was attached to it. At least from the time that Hebrew ceased to be a normal language, which is, again, in my opinion, the destruction of the first temple and the exile to Babylon. From then on, Hebrew became an abnormal language that exists in the mind of a certain literary and cultural elite, and was always attached to an ideology. The ideology could have been religious, or the ideology could have been national. The ideology was mystical. Later, the ideology became secular in the Enlightenment, where the new secular or secular wannabe intellectuals of the Jewish people went back to the holy language in order to create Judaism and Jewishness as modern secular, and using the romantic Greek. Zionism came, and Hebrew became even more of an ideology. Hebrew has become a declaration of a new ideal, return to the land, undoing of the diaspora, going under against the current of the Jewish vernaculars, Yiddish, Ladino, whatever languages my ancestors spoke in Iran, whatever the Jews spoke wherever they did. Hebrew was a new ideology. So when you speak Hebrew, it's never neutral. It is never, ever neutral. So there's so much complexity attached to the Hebrew. There's so many layers. For me, this is the most lush and wonderful environment to be in. Every word you press is like an icon on the computer. You press a word, boom, an explosion of content, history, ideology, mysticism, theology. A wonderful language to work with. Did I answer your question, Basmat?
Maybe you should know. Yes, thank you very much. That was a great introduction. I think in terms of like, now we're going to be a little more practical about the world as it is, and I think maybe more connected to also to what Rachel does daily, apparently, and because I want to look into this thing, which I think is really, really fascinating for me. You know, when I thought about our conversation, I thought about the movie Lost in Translation, not the movie itself, but actually the title. And I know you, Ruby, you write in Hebrew. You're a Hebrew writer, I would say. You live in New York. Your book was actually won a great prize here in Israel, the Sapir Prize, maybe the biggest prize here for literature. And then it got translated to English, right? And into Arabic also.
It was translated to Arabic by the Sapir Prize committee. They funded this translation, which was, I think, a very beautiful gesture, right? And it was also translated to.
And I actually have a feeling that your Arabic readers, Arab language readers, I would say, here around in the Middle East, maybe found it easier to understand the book, although the plot happens, or most of it happens in New York. I would think that maybe on some levels it was even easier to the Arabic reader to read it than the English reader. Anyway, but that has been said. I want to ask generally about this thing of reading translated literature. You know, I feel as a reader, I love reading. I read all the time still, and for me, actually, translated literature is many times a window into I get actually a peep into like the home of other cultures and languages. And here with the Hebrew, we have another interesting thing, which I think is connected to what you mentioned in the beginning as a biblical language. Hebrew actually has, in terms linguistically, in terms of the language itself, it has a very rooted past tense, a pretty good one for the future. And actually the present tense in Hebrew is the poorer, I would say. It almost doesn't exist. It's like we live, even the Bible takes us like into from the past to the future, and that's where we get our present tense, which is really interesting. And when we look especially at English is a language with some very core present tense, I would say, building blocks. And what do you think about, as a Hebrew writer, as a Hebrew reader, as an English speaker who lives in New York, what do you feel? How do you feel about reading translated literature, and what do you think are the advantages of actually trying to make that thing happen? To actually hear you showed us your book, and I think it's a great thing to do. And I'm curious about what you think about actually reading poetry, reading literature in another language.
Thank you for this question. First of all, I want to go back to what the first thing you said about living between languages and living in, basically in translation, if you will, and writing Hebrew in a non-Hebrew environment. So before I speak about what I read, which of course is connected to this, and how I felt about the translation of my work, I would like to share with you the experience of living in one language while writing and thinking in another. And that for me was a very intense and in a way wonderful experience, because I feel that I came to New York some 22 years ago because of a wonderful reason. An old love story was rekindled. A lovely young woman I met in Jerusalem years before, and I have reconnected, and I came to New York to give it a chance, and thankfully it worked so well. So we're living here, and as you said, raising two girls, and we had all kinds of fantasies about living between the countries and going back and forth. But once the first kid comes to the world, you realize that fantasies are great, but there has to be a reality, and you need a home base, and there has to be a... So I found myself living in New York and having to carve out my own Hebrew universe. Unlike many Israelis I know, my immediate social environment is not necessarily all Israelis. I met a lot of people, friends and family through Carolyn's world, and therefore I immediately became very comfortable in New York with non-Hebrew speakers, many of whom Jewish Americans, American Jews, but not only. And so there was definitely an element of living in translation. Now, I always felt very comfortable with languages. I'm bilingual to begin with, because growing up, I was very close with a grandmother who did not speak a word of Hebrew, but spoke Persian. And with her, I spoke mostly only Persian. So I grew up with two languages as it is. As a result, by the way, I still sound sometimes when I speak Persian like a 9-year-old woman Jewish woman from a northeastern province of Iran, because she was the source of my language. So that does not cease to amuse my listeners in Persian. But so to begin with, I already grew up with a dual language identity. And I think it's more than a language identity. I believe that with every language you speak, there's a persona that is born with it. It really feels differently. Like there's a certain persona that the language creates in you. As a result of moving to New York, I feel that what happened to my Hebrew, which always tended to be more literary and more kind of puristic than many others, it became more so. In a way, coming to New York and writing Hebrew in New York undid the whole move to like take the Hebrew from the diaspora, bring it to the promised land, and make it into a normal language. What happened is I took my Hebrew.
I would say maybe Ruby, I will interrupt you, and I would say maybe we're thinking about, and I know for sure in Rachel's family as well, we're talking about 4 generations maybe of people who their native language wasn't necessarily their mother's tongue. Yeah. Meaning there was this whole thing of like mother's tongue was not necessarily the language that children spoke as their first language, or the opposite. True. Which is just going back to your story about your grandmother too.
Kind of amazing that I continued this line, yes, to continue the journeys of the Hebrew. And I know that Basmat, you write about this, and your beautiful new book, Shamiya Zahav, you know, that I hope will be translated to English soon. you also explore the idea of the wandering Jew, in your case, the Jewess, and it's of course a metaphor to the language as well. Yes, that is wandering and is always on the move. I just want to say that I think the Hebrew is a very strange language in the way that it's always geared towards the place, but it's actually has been in transition all its history. Actually, the term Ivrit means the language of transition. Avar, me'ever nahar, from the other side of the river. The language is always either coming from the other side of the river or maybe going to the other side. It's always in transition. So I sitting in New York, and I love working in cafes and sitting and opening my laptop, and around me there's English, and then I open my laptop and a whole new world emerges from the screen. In a way, I feel that this existence has taken the Hebrew back into its previous incarnation as Lashon HaKodesh, as the language of the sacred, because it was no longer the language of my everyday. It's not the language with which I walk the dog or shop in Fairway or whatever I do. It is the language in which I write. So in a strange way, it's almost like it stepped back in time to Hebrew a minute before it was resurrected as a spoken language. So that's a strange kind of translation already. And also back to the purity of the language. I mean, first of all, there's nothing more pathetic than an older person who hasn't been living in a language to try to speak in slang, because our slang by definition is going to be dated and will make us look ridiculous. But I was never very drawn to slang, and definitely not to writing in spoken Hebrew. So for me, it worked so well with my literary tendencies of writing in a language that is almost hyper-literary, that embraces the fact that it's not a normal language. As part of the effort to preserve the language, there's an everyday effort. It's not something you can take for granted. If I just let loose, let my hair down, relax, my Hebrew will not survive. I feel that I have to constantly work out the language so that it will remain structured, pure, defined. So every day there's a work of translation, of trying to remove the everyday, decide this is Hebrew, this is not, this I incorporate into my language, this I don't. So every influence, everything that comes into my language, I must inspect and see, do I let it in or not? I think maybe that's why I was so drawn to the imagery of the priestly existence in the ruined house, because of this obsession with the pure and the impure, the holy and the profane. It was also a way in which I regard language. When I read, I try to read only in Hebrew. And yes, I know it's crazy to being able to read in English, to choose to read a wonderful English novel in an Hebrew translation that could be wonderful or could be okay translation. Yes, there is a sacrifice. However, I feel that I can't afford lapsing into a kind of muddied language, into Hinglish or Hebrewish, or one of those middle grounds that actually are neither here nor there, this limbo between languages. So one of the decisions I made is to read in Hebrew. to refrain from reading in English. So when people speak about new books, if I read them, I've read the Hebrew translation. But this is, again, somebody wrote a beautiful comment now, like a gardener. Exactly. Yes. Thank you for this. Like a gardener, weeding out the garden so that the beautiful roses of Hebrew will grow in it. And you know, I am actually grateful for this challenge, because I think that not take your language for granted, never be able to take a language for granted, is a great gift for an author and a writer. It turns almost your prose into poetry. You know, for me, the difference in prose and poetry is that in poetry, the language is the goal, not just the mean. And it turns prose into poetry, that the language in itself is your goal, not just the mean in which you tell a good story. And therefore,
So,
sorry, please.
no. Finish your sentence. I wanted to.
That's why it is very exciting when you mentioned that the work of Rachel as a translator, as a teacher translator, because then there's something that brings your work to the world in a way that's so exciting. Because I do believe that in spite of the fact that we focus on our language, we do raise our eyes from the keyboard, and we do want our words to have a universal impact. I do, at least.
I'm sure. So if you don't mind, my next question will go actually to Rachel, because I feel like I want her to shed another light about what you said, but be prepared, because then I have another question for you. Rachel, before I ask you my question, if you don't mind, I'm going to read a short verse from one of, I know, is someone who is our favorite poets, Yehuda Amichai. And I want to ask you about being a tourist in another language. And what do you see when you're a tourist in another language? What do you see when you're not lost in translation, but you're actually a tourist in another culture and language? And I will, if you don't mind, read the short verse from one of my favorite poems, Tourists. Once I sat on the steps by the gate at David's Tower. I placed my 2 heavy baskets at my side. A group of tourists was standing around their guide, and I became their target marker. You see that man with the basket? Just right of his head, there is an arch from the Roman period, just right of his head. But he's moving. I said to myself, redemption will come only if their guide tells them, you see that art from the Roman period? It's not important. But next to it, left and down a bit, there sits a man who bought fruits and vegetables for his family. So that was just a short anecdote, I think, as to think about
Basmat, you have no idea.
See and what they don't.
Well, you have no idea what you have done, because bringing up tourists today, first of all, today is Avichai's Yortzeit.
Oh my God.
Oh yeah, 22nd Yortzeit.
Wow.
Yeah.
Right.
Second
There's actually I couldn't go today to the.
You couldn't go to Eliazar's event, remembering Yehuda, because you came here, and I couldn't be there because both of us, have we not been here, we would have been there. But an hour ago, I was teaching tourists to my book club in Hebrew and English, and telling stories that I will not tell now of a special encounter when teaching tourists, and Amichai showed up while doing it. I'm not telling the story, but I'm answering your question in a different way. I taught tourists today as Amichai's response to Agnon's paragraph in Tehillah, when he talks about, then there was the business with the tourists that come here, and we could see in class the conversation, because Agnon finishes that paragraph Maybe one day a sage will come and explain to us that difference between seeing. And I suggested the option that Amichai picked up the glove and said to Agnon, let me try. Let me try, Shmuel Yosef, to explain what I see in the way the tourists see and the way others see. And that level of language, Basmat, that level of language, Ruby, is the hardest part. Not in the translation, it's what I call in Hebrew tivuch, and I will use the English word bridging instead. Because when I choose, and the reading and choosing of poems to a given session out of the 420 that we have recorded is how much of the context of the language I can bridge. Which poem shall I choose where I know that I do justice by Zelda, by Leah Goldberg, our beloved, and by the new poets of today? How much context do I need to do? What spheres and spheres of language need to come in? And oftentimes I will let off Dalia Rabikovich because I cannot do it justice. Because she says, Haruach noshevet b'charigim, and she meant charachim, and I will need an hour to explain the difference, and I'll say, I'll let it go. And I will not teach it today. I will on Tuesday, though, if you come. Anyway, so I'm talking, Basmat and Ruby, beyond what you were saying, because the language is not just those words on the paper, but what they carry along, who they quote, who they are in conversation with, because I mentioned Avichai being in conversation with Agnon, and we know the layers of conversations Agnon is having with the ones that came before him. So that's the beauty, that's the challenge of what we are doing, and it's a literally every day, oftentimes night struggle of that gardener work of weeding, so that I can bring that which I can do justice to, or at least close to justice to.
Beautiful.
So I'm looking at the 130 people just sitting with us here today, and I know there are many more that you've taught around the world. And my next question, Ruby, will actually, I want to go because I think that what Rachel is doing is maybe a work of redemption, I would say. She also redeems the words from their closed, I would say, area that they're written into. Rachel, I'm actually taking what you're saying, and I want to give it the, switch it around a little bit and say that what you're doing is not only making it accessible, but you're also redeeming the words from being local into being really universal in a way. And especially, I think, for people who yearn to have some kind of contact with the Hebrew language and those words and the world me'ever from the other side that is happening. And actually the two cultures that maybe as we, for sure, the three of us, I think, live at mamash for real in our lives, and so many people, and we think that actually it's one of the greatest missions maybe of our generation, bring the American Jewish culture and the Hebrew Israeli culture into a dialogue. And Ruby, so that takes me to my next question. And as I look at the time, maybe our last question today, as we have 5 minutes left, what's your vision about actually the connection between those two languages, and how do you see yourself also as a writer being part of that vision?
Yeah. Thank you. First of all, I want to just mention that The Ruined House, Habayit Asher Nechrav, the title of my latest novel, is actually a quote from Yehuda Amichai poem. And Yehuda Amichai is a minor character there that and his Yortzeit is mentioned in the, so there's all the strings are somehow tied to each other. And I want to go back to Rachel's beautiful mention of Tehillah, of this wonderful novella by Shai Agnon, an author, by the way, who never, I don't feel that the work of Agnon made the splash it would have made in English somehow, in spite of some really wonderful translations that were made. And Agnon in Tehillah speaks about when the tourists come to our city, Jerusalem, we show them around, and by showing them around, we see our own city. And I want to take this little anecdotal thing that he says and implement it on the Hebrew, and on the Hebrew literature, and on the work of cultural and literary mediation that Rachel mentioned so beautifully. There is something about opening our Hebrew to the world, the translation, being part of the world, that actually teaches us about ourselves, makes us, as a language, as a culture, as a civilization, not take ourselves for granted. I feel that this was the vocation, the calling of the Hebrew from the beginning. We were not meant to be a small, insular little culture that looks inside and only cares about itself. The Hebrew always thought of itself as Lashon Olam, which means that the language of before time, but also means the language of the world. The Hebrew always thought of itself as having a universal calling. And I wish that we, the Hebrew authors and the poets and the wordsmiths, will learn and will live up to this expectation of really creating a significant work in the Hebrew that will have universal value, that will be worthy of teachers like Rachel Korazim, will be worthy of mediators that will bring this. I view it as a light. I am a romantic, and I do believe that we have to be a light to the nations in a way that we must surpass ourselves and really have a work with universal value. And by showing and bringing our work to the world and our message to the world, we also get to know each other better. It's ourselves. We get the real understanding of our place in the world and our calling. So I feel that these wonderful words that we just heard from Rachel are a very good way of closing all this conversation between us, because I feel that without that mediation, without that constant work of having every word resonate in the world, and if it can't resonate, you make a choice to bring those that can resonate, we will be betraying our calling. This level of attention, this level of deliberation, and this level of intention to be relevant is, for me, the best way to view my work as a writer. And I thank you, and I thank Rachel for this.
And maybe because it's the Yortzeit of Yehuda Amichai, we'll just finish with a few more of his words, another verse from another poem. But this time I'll read the Hebrew first, so you can actually see that I can read fluently. אלוהים זועם עליי, כי אני מכריח אותו תמיד לברוא את העולם מחדש. מתוהו ובוהו, אור, יום שני, עד האדם וחוזר חלילה. God is angry with me because I always force him to create the world once again, from chaos, light, second day, until man, and back to the beginning. And I think what Amichai is speaking about here is really the relationship, as you started with, will be between the divine and the poet. And I think that that relationship, Rachel, as the teacher who stands between the divine and the poet, I think, and basically making it, as we said, accessible to people, and not only accessible, making it beautiful, making us. I know as your student, I take your teachings with me for many, many, many years. I still remember things that you've taught me really 30-something years ago at your house at Haifa then. And I think what a great teacher does is really enabling that secret conversation between the poet and the divine coming to our lives, and you're actually making us part of that, I would say, circulation of creating the world anew each time we hear those poems, and basically enabling us to look at the world differently from a new perspective. So thank you so much for that.
Thank you very much, Basmat.
Thank you.
So I'm gonna jump in, and before I say thank you, since I received a lot of questions, I just picked 2 gems and I'm gonna ask them. Okay, so Ruby, we're gonna try 2 questions in 3 minutes. And one was, is there right now a specific Hebrew word that you feel very fond of? And if you can share it, a word or a phrase in Hebrew that is right now kind of cursing through your mind, and if you can share it with us and why.
Just a Hebrew word. I think a lot about the word Nahar, river. It's a word that never ceases to excite me. As you know, there are no real rivers in the actual Hebrew geography. And here I am in New York, living on the banks of the river Hudson, which is a very majestic river. And the Hebrew word Nahar, is so much more than just a body of water. It goes all the way to Genesis, the Garden of Eden, V'nahar yotze me'Eden, a river that kind of flows into the world. And then there's the mystical and Kabbalistic and modern allusions to it. So, and of course, Nahar is Nehara, which is like a light, a abundance of light, and so on and so forth. So this is a word that I almost every day think about.
Thank you. And we'll end with a question of when are we expecting the next book? Is something on the way? What are you working on now?
Yeah, I'm basically finished and about to send to my publisher a new collection of short stories. Some of them translated to English already, others not yet. And I hope that it's going to be published in Israel very soon, and hopefully soon after that in English as well.
Amazing.
And these are Hebrew stories with very strong American themes. So it's really, again, trying to use the Hebrew in order to look at a new world with an old language.
Thank you. Thank you very much. We'll obviously be sending a lot of follow-up links. I think this conversation is so beautifully brought together many, many things, and it felt, and I want to thank Basmat and Rachel and Ruby, it felt like having a ton of doors and windows just being opened and calling to set out on new journeys of exploration. So thank you so much for this inspiring conversation. Thank you, everyone that was.
Shirel, can I ask that in the follow-up material, you will include my email for people who are not yet in our poetry classes and would like to join? The simple thing is just email me. Okay, so please include my email in the follow-up. Thank you.
Absolutely. So thank you. very, very much. You can see here in the comments that are open already. Also people thanking you. And for those of you who will see on online programs in this week, which we have a few more, we'll see you there. And if not, Shana Tova. It's lovely to see you all, and have a wonderful day or afternoon or evening, wherever you are. Thank you, everyone.
Thank you very, very much.
Shana Tova.
Thank you, Basmat. And congratulations again,
Yeah.
Rachel.
Pleasure. Thank you very much. Good to see all of you, Chevre.
Good to see you.